Days away from the close of polling in the leadership contest for the Conservative Party, which will choose our next Prime Minister. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, the front runner, she pulled out of an interview with the BBC. Her team says she couldn't spare the time. But it's not the first time Liz Truss has refused to engage with the media. Some say just picking up where Boris Johnson left off. Is there a wider point, though, about our politicians maybe refusing to answer difficult questions, maybe not putting themselves up for scrutiny when they could? Let's welcome a Times columnist, Rachel Sylvester. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
Hi, good of you to join us. And Joey Jones, former spokesman for the former Prime Minister Theresa May, is with us too. Hi, Joey.
Hi, John.
And let me say hi to the studio and welcome to Adam Boulton, who is the new voice of politics on Times Radio on Sunday morning, starting this Sunday, or rather one of two. He's going to be alongside Kate McCann, the twin of voices of politics on Sunday morning, although the physical resemblance may escape many people. It's good to see you here, Adam.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, what do you think about this? There's Liz Truss. Apparently, well, we know she's not doing the interview with Nick Robinson on the BBC, and we know also it's not because she hasn't got time.
Oh, we know that as well. I mean, don't forget, she even snubbed the great Andrew Neil on the Channel 4, and he, of course, had a bit of a problem because in the last election, he seemed to be the last extended interviewer going, and he was snubbed by Boris Johnson. So I think one does have to assume something's going on. Now, one argument they can make is there are more outlets than ever, there's more competition, they want to be fair. I don't actually believe any of that. I think it's quite clear from the tactics with which Sir Linton Crosby fights elections, that basically exposing yourself in areas where you can make gaffes or other people can set the agenda is something he firmly advises against.
Right. I mean, Joey Jones, if you can put yourself just for a moment into the shoes of Liz Truss's media minders, what would you be doing right now? Would you be saying, look, go ahead and do a big interview at this particular stage of the game, or would you be saying, keep well clear?
Well, I think if she'd committed to doing it, which, as I understand, she had committed to doing it, then you would normally expect her to follow through and do the interview. Obviously, they've made some sort of a hard-headed, pragmatic decision, and I think it's broadly reflective of a political class that has woken up to the fact, if you like, that in the power dynamic between them and the media, they hold the whip hand if they want to walk away from doing interviews. Boris Johnson has managed to do it with impunity in the past. And these things do go in cycles, but there's definitely been a massive change from when Adam and I obviously worked together at Sky, where you did feel as though if a politician was going to do a media round, they would try to be fair. They would try to allocate time to all outlets, regardless of what audience figures that they were, but based on the credibility of the journalists. And there aren't many journalists, obviously, more credible than Nick Robinson. But we've had a situation where there have been boycotts. I mean, under Dominic Cummings' stewardship of Downing Street, they were boycotting Channel 4 News, they were boycotting Piers Morgan, they were boycotting Newsnight and all the rest of it. So it goes in cycles, but it's definitely, every time I see a politician walking away from a serious, interrogative interview with holding them to account, yes, I worry about it and I don't like it.
I mean, if you go back to the 90s and before, there was, in the minds and the hearts of politicians and those surrounding our politicians at the top of the game, a feeling of obligation, a feeling that there was a duty to answer questions, no matter how tough times seemed to be. I mean, I can remember, and look, you'll remember this, Adam, go back to the Westland crisis, long forgotten by most people if they ever heard anything about it. Margaret Thatcher's, she felt her future was absolutely on the edge, and on a Sunday morning she was facing a very difficult broadcast TV interview, and she still felt there was no option but to take that interview. No one would dream of doing such a thing.
No, indeed, she used to regard it as an obligation every single foreign trip she did to do a bank of interviews at the end of it explaining what had gone on. Now, that's long gone away. And we have to remember even Tony Blair, who I think, you can see with the arrival of Alistair Campbell, the kind of media control coming in there. But Tony Blair decided that he was going to do monthly news conferences, and he did them through thick and thin. Even if it was a very bad day to do it, he went out there and he took all comers for 90 minutes. And I think people have turned away from that. And I think it's possibly, dare one say it, that the product is actually not as good as it used to be. No. That Mrs. Thatcher, Tony Blair could cope with this kind of thing, whereas you know, Liz Truss, for example, we know has had to execute a number of U-turns just in this brief leadership campaign.
Yeah, but the realisation that politicians and ministers don't have to do interviews seems to sort of sprout from that time under Tony Blair, under Alastair Campbell, I suppose, in particular. What are your thoughts, Rachel? I mean, is this now, has the wheel turned and isn't going to turn again? Are we in a new reality here when it comes to that relationship between our politicians, our leaders, and our media, and in that way with the country?
I think a confident politician with a message that they believe in is willing and happy to speak to the media because they want to speak to the voters. In the end, this is about politicians getting through to the electorate, which when it comes to an election, they're going to need to do. And I think the problem for Liz Truss is that there's a huge black hole in her campaign on the most important issue of the day, which is cost of living, where she's saying she's not really going to say what she's going to do in detail until she gets to Downing Street. So under scrutiny from a forensic journalist like Nick Robinson, that's going to very quickly fall apart and highlight the problems in her campaign. But the solution to that isn't to pull out of media interviews. The solution to that is to have a policy.
I wonder, Rachel, I mean, we're talking about broadcasting, Joey and me, worked together a long time on Sky. Are you finding the same thing in print? Because you and Alice Thompson, of course, have done famous series of interviews. You actually finding it harder to get to interview the people you want?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, successive Downing Streets have said, refused to do interviews with us. David Cameron used to call us the terrible twins, because I think they thought we'd ask unpredictable questions, which is infuriating at one level as a journalist, but also in a way a badge of honour. There was one absolutely ridiculous example where a junior minister called John Hayes had begged us to do an interview. And then when we turned up at the appointed hour at the Cabinet Office where he then was, he kept us waiting for 3 hours. And it turned out that he'd bumped into Cameron on the way to the interview, and he told him on no account was he to do the interview. And that he'd then spent sort of 3 hours trying to think of excuses, and it got increasingly ridiculous. But I think it's got harder and harder and tougher to get politicians when they don't feel in control. And I think that's a lack of confidence on their part, rather than the brilliance of necessarily the journalists. I think if they really had something to say, then they'd want to sell that message. The problem is the sort of vacuum.
And even if they don't, guys, I mean, on Adam's point, Joey, of the caliber of today's top-ranked politician, it ought not to be beyond the powers of a high-ranking politician to deal with it, to deal with an interview. And we do not have in our hands, as we do an interview, a syringe of sodium pentothal. We do not have thumb screws. A politician of high rank, worthy of his or her salt, ought to be able to keep control of what's going on. Say what they want to say. Maybe they will let show a little bit of petticoat, at a particular moment, but they should not be afraid. Surely, if they're doing their job and doing it remotely well, of taking those questions and still communicating on terms that do not serve them entirely badly.
No, you're right. I mean, look, as I say, I genuinely regret it, and I think it devalues our whole political discourse that we don't have more of these interviews. I guess the one difference to 10 years ago is that they know that if they make an error of tonality, as well as even if it's tonality, maybe not substance, it will get clipped up and it will get disseminated in social media and taken out of context in a way that is difficult for them. But for me, the thing is that the media has had the opportunity to stamp on this, particularly if we refer to the broadcast media. It is a power dynamic. And the problem is that the broadcasters don't often work together to actually say this is not acceptable. So when there was a whole raft of outlets being with politicians refusing to turn up on them, you know what they should have done? BBC Breakfast should have said, if you're not doing Piers Morgan, you're not doing BBC Breakfast either. And it would have been to all of our long-term benefit. Instead, I suspect they were quite gleeful about the fact they were the only ones that were getting a senior minister on the morning round, which in the long run does us all a disservice.
What about that, Adam? The idea of a national union of high standards in
well, we
discourse.
can have another discussion. I mean, I worked for a long time to try and get proper debates going at election time, and again, they only happened once in 2010, and they've been degraded. And this time round, we actually had the Conservatives saying openly they wouldn't have the two candidates debating with each other after a few false starts. So it's definitely going on. And of course, there are two problems that we in the media have. One is that, we're not trying to serve ourselves, we're trying to serve the public. But the other is that even with the public, we are probably about as unpopular as politicians. So if we get into these spats, there isn't a great deal of public sympathy saying, oh, yeah, you must give Nick Robinson an interview, or you must give Andrew Neil an interview. And that, I think, is possibly a mistake we've made, that we have, in some cases, allowed egos and personalities to become equivalent to politicians, which, of course, they're not.
What do you reckon to that? Rachel, let's say let's refer to it as we, our side of this relationship, our side of this bargain, are we letting the higher standard to which we're paying our tributes today, are we letting that standard down by taking advantage of a politician or a campaign camp, pitting one against the other, putting one side in the corner of the room with with your face against the wall, and then saying that you can gain from that, don't complain too much about it?
I think it's inevitable that there's some competition between media outlets and journalists. But I think what we've got to remember is it's really not about us. It's about the public, and it's about politicians being able to explain their message to the voters under scrutiny. So what the politicians think increasingly is that they can bypass the media using social media, using their own platforms, using blogs and YouTube clips and everything. But that's propaganda. That's not scrutiny. That's not them being challenged and cross-examined. And I think it's incredibly important that we are there as journalists to challenge politicians, not for ourselves, not for self-aggrandizement of the media, but on behalf of the public and on behalf of the voters, particularly at such a difficult time.
Do you reckon, Joey, the idea of a duty to be accountable, has that simply gone completely out of fashion in political circles now? It existed very strongly. It seems not to be so now.
I don't think it's gone out of fashion in all parties. I just think that, as I say, there are some very hard-headed, and I think, for me, are some unpalatable decisions that are being made by some politicians.
Well, you don't see very much of Keir Starmer, do you? Keir Starmer seems to be invisible an awful lot of the time. Look, you would be bidding for him, I'm sure day in, day out, so you would know better than I do. Can I just come back to one point about journalists? Because there's one thing that I do feel that has arisen. I'm not sure that it's necessarily all journalists' fault, but there is this idea that journalists are all, are biased, they have an axe to grind, there's sort of a conspiracy idea, and there's a lot of tension between, particularly, maybe the BBC and this current government, or Channel 4 and this government. And I do think that when I see someone like Andrew Marr, who I have a massive amount of respect for, saying that he was looking forward when he went to LBC to being able to speak with his own voice, it speaks to this idea that somehow impartiality is like a muzzle, that is somehow it is that people aren't allowed, that we're all basically, we're opinion shock jocks wanting to get out. And I think that has allowed a real concept of the liberating principle of impartiality, which was, as I saw it when I was at Sky, that I could have a go at anybody, and they would know that it's just because I'm doing my job that liberating principle of impartiality has been lost. And I think we may struggle to get that back, for all that it's front of Tim Davies' intro. Well, I never felt as if I was being let off a leash when I left the
exactly.
BBC. I mean,
I agree entirely with everything that Joey said. He puts it fantastically well, and he goes back to what Rachel said and what has been said to me many times by very famous journalists. It should not be about you. You are obviously, everyone brings some personality to it, but it's not about you. It's about getting out of them and scrutinising what they've got to say.
Well, guys, it's really, really good to talk to you. Adam, thanks for coming in. Looking forward to your show on Sunday morning with Kate McCann.
10
You're going to be
me
on
too.
from 10 a.m. on Times Radio. Twin stars back in the firmament. And Joey Jones, Rachel Sylvester, lovely to talk to you as always. Let's do it again before too very long.